Hello there, I'm Paul C. I'm the pastor of Charles Wesley United Methodist Church and Abingdon United Methodist Church, both churches here on Main Street in Abingdon, Virginia. And I'm here with Jerry Jones. And Jerry is, Jerry's just done a lot here in Washington County. We're going to have a conversation today about Black history in Washington County, Virginia, about Jerry's life. And we'll just see where this conversation takes us. So, Jerry, it's good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Jerry's the author of a couple of books, but one of those books is this wonderful book here. It's called Go and Come Again, Segregation, Tolerance, and Reflection, a four-generation African-American educational struggle. And that's his picture on the cover right there. So it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And I thought we just have a conversation about some of the things that you cover in this book and other things. You speak a lot around the area and have become kind of a go-to figure for the history of the Black community here in Washington County. And I appreciate you coming today because you're sometimes on the go a lot, aren't you?
Yes, sometimes.
Well, I thought what we could start with would you give us an overview of your roots here in Washington County and how you went away and came home again?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I should mention is that I'm a native of Glade Spring. Mm-hmm. And the thing that makes it sort of unique is that I was born in the house where I currently live. And that was not a rarity once upon a time. I know of a number of people where generations of that family may be traced back to having been born in that house. So I was born in, in the house in the 40s, late 40s. My mom was born in the same house in 1911. But the thing that really seems shocking to most people is when I say I can take it even further. My grandmother was born in the house in 1874. So that means that for four generations, some of my family has been in that same house, that same location, on one of the main thoroughfares there in Glade Spring. Interestingly enough, is that growing up in the 1950s, one of the reasons for the book is that we had an integrated situation on my street. And I had white friends and black friends, and we played together and all of that. And some people don't believe me when I say it, but it was really true. And that was my benchmark. That's what I measured everything against. When I went off other places, I said, but this is not the way it was back in good old Glade Spring, you know. Yeah. But anyway, briefly, my story is that I started elementary school in the fall of 1953. Mm-hmm. Schools were certainly segregated back then. So the black kids had their school in one side of Glade Spring and the white kids in another side. And both of them were called Glade Spring Elementary Schools. Well, how did we distinguish them? The streets didn't even have names back in the 50s. So ours was the colored one and the other one was the white one. But essentially, you didn't really need to throw in that word. You could tell that there was a significant difference in terms of size. The fact that ours had the outdoor plumbing kind of a scenario and so forth. But overall, the schooling was not that bad. It was just that because of its size, we probably missed out on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But back in those days, the basics didn't take a lot of technology to teach grammar rules and to teach how to read and write and so forth. When I finished the 7th grade in 1960, high school was not to be had for blacks in the county. Mm. So we were bused all the way to Bristol to what was then Douglas High School. Mm. And that lasted for me from 1960 to 1965. 8 through 12 was at Douglas. Incidentally, it should be mentioned that Patrick Henry, the white school that would serve Glade Spring and surrounding area, was brand new in 1960. But the situation was just not for integration to occur then. A lot of it may have been local, but in retrospect, my feeling is that it would have been something that would have occurred if the top-down hierarchy had said, well, we're going to integrate, that's the way it is. Brown versus Board of Education was passed in 1954, I believe it was, but this was 1960 and we were still...
Hadn't made its way to Washington County.
Had not.
How far, if you mind me asking, how far from your house to Patrick Henry High School? Less than 5 minutes?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And how far of a bus ride from your house to Douglas High School in Bristol?
About almost an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
And I had
one way.
Yeah, one way. And several reasons why it took so long. One, there was no interstate in 1950 anything, or in 1960. Yeah. The other thing was that we kids lived in a variety of little communities. So you had, even if there had been an interstate in 1960, we still probably would not have made it in less than an hour, simply because there were kids in Glade even had suburbs, believe it or not. One suburb was called Plum Creek. Then another subdivision or sub area was called Clarksville. I lived in the town. That's the way I lived in town. And then there was students in the Blacksburg community, which is south of Route 11.
Not the Blacksburg that we think of
Virginia Tech. Not the Virginia Tech Blacksburg, but the Blacksburg community, which had ties to Emory and Henry, by the way. And then, of course, Abingdon, places like Wendell and Tumbling Creek. I think Tumbling Creek had to be bused by a smaller bus to Meadowview.
To meet your bus.
To meet my bus, yeah. And then there were the kids that lived in Damascus. And some of that's sort of vague in my mind, but I think they rode a commuter bus over here to Abingdon.
And got picked up. Now there were students also from Saltville, which is even further out in the county.
Yes.
And so they would have been on the bus for 2 hours maybe?
Well, what happened was, in the years that I was going to Douglas, a parent drove the Saltville kids to Glade Spring to catch the bus. In other years, they had other arrangements. I interviewed some students who said that there was a contract with a cab company in Saltville. And this was an elementary school kid he had gone to elementary at Douglas because Saltville did not want him to their school. Yeah.
Now, you've also mentioned before, now we should say, Douglas High School is named for Frederick Douglass.
That's correct.
So there's two S's
at
the end of that. And where is that now? Because the building is still there.
The building is still there. It's at the corner of Martin Luther King Boulevard and Moore Street and whatever the street is that's really like Lee Highway coming into Bristol. It's right there at the intersection.
And it's apartment homes now.
Yeah, it says Douglas Apartments, Douglas School Apartments.
Douglas School Apartments.
And it's been like that for decades.
So you can still see the building
Yes.
if you go there now.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
So that's just something to think about. That's a long commute.
A long commute, and one of the things about the commute, of course, it was enough to deal with that 5 days a week, but what about extracurricular activities that high schools have? I obviously did not play football. I say obviously because I'm skinny today just as I was back then. But a lot of the county guys were on the football team. So during the football season, that meant 2 round trips for the bus driver. He would take us to school in the morning. When school was over, girls and skinny guys got on the bus and were brought home. And as soon as he got to Glade Spring, he would turn around and go all the way back to Bristol to pick up those guys that had played, practiced football. Yeah. And that was just not for football, any activity.
Baseball or
baseball. In my case, I was in the choir. And sometimes the choir had events, like we sang once at Virginia Junior High for some type of musical thing. Sometimes you had to just get back to Bristol on your own.
It was just up to you.
It was just up to you.
But there was nowhere in Bristol for you all to stay if you had like an evening game or event.
Not really.
Unless you knew somebody.
Unless we knew somebody, that's
but
true.
But not provided by the school.
That's right, that's right. I'm trying to think, did I ever stay in Bristol overnight? I don't think so. I did stay in Abingdon once overnight. A friend of mine, his father was then the pastor of Valley Street Baptist. His name was Reverend Hall. And Reverend Hall and Mrs. Hall had a son named S.L. And S.L. and I were friends, and I remember one night staying with them. I can't remember what the event was, but I do remember that.
I think it's important to note that going to school in Bristol, Virginia, at Douglas, you were not a part of the Washington County school system. Then they were essentially outsourcing your education to Bristol, Virginia, and they paid a sum of money for tuition.
Yes, they did. Okay. Yes, they did. And it should also be mentioned that because we were going to school in a non-Washington County situation, in the wintertime, if Washington County schools closed, that did not necessarily mean that Bristol schools were going to be closed as well. So there were a number of times in the early 60s when our bus was the only school bus on the county road.
Out on those icy roads?
Yes, yes. So it didn't hurt that our bus driver was a part-time minister.
Oh, yeah. Can you tell the story about how you kept your feet warm on the bus more than once, I guess?
Yes. It was my mom's doing, bless her heart. She put a brick on one of the stoves, and bricks absorbed the heat. And of course, the brick was eventually wrapped in cloth, aluminum foil first, I believe. I can't remember, did we actually have aluminum foil in the 60s? I guess we must have. Yeah. But anyway, it worked. And of course, I would have the brick in a paper bag, a paper poke, as they once called it. And I would carry that to school and put my feet on. The reason the bus was so cold is there was a heater, but the heater was up front near the driver. In later years, our school bus was rather long because we used to have two short buses, and they were getting kind of old. So instead of giving us two new buses, they gave us one long one, and through all of us, when I say us, I mean the Glade Spring area as well as the Abingdon area, there were a number of years when we were all on the same bus. So that means a long bus.
In the back of it
and in
cold.
The back it got cold because given the weather, you just couldn't get the heater. Even if he let it run for a long time, it just didn't make its way to the back. And so there was a long period of time. And of course, I was always skinny, and I think that's one of the reasons that my extremities would get so cold. But it worked.
It worked.
It worked.
It makes a good story.
It does too.
And you were in the last graduating class of Douglas High School, is that right?
That's right. Class of 65. 65.
So a year later, students who lived in Glade would have gone to Patrick Henry.
That's correct. So anybody who was behind me, what they experienced was significantly different from what I experienced. And by that I mean, if you have spent 3 or 4 years at Douglas or any school, only to have your senior year, which has all those memories and proms and all that, being in an environment that's kind of new to you, I can imagine the thoughts and emotions that some of those people went through. Yeah. But I did not experience that.
And so after graduation, you went on to college and to graduate school, and you taught in the Richmond area for a while?
Yeah, my first teaching job was in Baltimore, and that was not to my liking. I didn't want to go to a city of that size or any size. And the reason I ended up going to Baltimore is because I couldn't find a teaching job anywhere in the state of Virginia in the fall of '69. And in retrospect, some of it obviously was about not just me being black, but also being male. And you would say, well, what, haven't we had males forever?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but even in the 60s, there was a mystique, maybe that's the wrong word, about African American young men.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, we talk about that all the time. But even back then, there was something about the notion of a black man being in a close environment with white girls and white boys as well, I guess. So it wasn't about my academics, because I did well at Virginia State. That's where I went. And by the way, I need to back up for a minute and say that I had to make a decision whether I was going to Virginia State, which is an HBCU in Petersburg. I had sort of a quasi offer to go to Emory and Henry and be one of the first blacks at that school as a full-time student. And the reason for that invitation was because, backing up, in the summer of '64, I was on the Emory campus for not regular college, but for like a summer enrichment kind of a thing.
Okay.
There were two of us there, a girl from Slater High, which is the Bristol, Tennessee's black school, or was, and me from Douglas. And what I didn't know at the time is it was all a part of Emory and Henry's master plan. They had resolved that they were going to finally integrate. This was like 1964 going into '65. And so what better way to do it than to have two blacks on campus when it's summertime, few people around, in an environment that's still high schoolish, if you will. And so I had to make a decision. Do I become a pioneer at Emory and Henry in the fall of '65, or do I go to an all-black college in Petersburg? And the reason I felt inclined to go to the black school was I didn't know how strong my grades 1 through 12. I didn't know how good that was. It was all black, I knew that. And there were some courses even at Douglas that we didn't have, because a small school can't have as many offerings as a larger school. So that I chose Virginia State.
Okay. And after your career in Richmond, I believe it felt at Morris. Is that the name of the college?
Oh, J. Sargent Reynolds.
J. Sargent Reynolds.
Yes.
I had the other tobacco magnate.
Yes,
in
right.
mind, yeah.
Yeah, that was essentially my main career, if you will.
And then you retired from that and had a second career at Emory and Henry.
Yes. So I taught at J. Sargent Reynolds in Richmond for 27 years and taught at Emory and Henry for 20 years. So help me out, 20 and 27 is 47. That's a long time. Wherever it is, that's a long time.
Taught a lot.
Plus the 5 years in Baltimore.
Wow.
So it ends up being 50 plus.
Okay.
And that's what the next book's supposed to be about.
Not your life and education.
Yeah, in education. Not so much the segregation and all that, although it pops up occasionally.
Now, you told me, not just me, you told a group of us recently that you have now been the longest serving African American faculty member at Emory and Henry.
That's true.
That's fantastic.
That's true. Yeah.
The school just down the street.
Just down the street. And it's so ironic on so many levels. First of all, the entrance to Emory, which is near the underpass, that's got the thing painted with Emory College, we made that route every day for 5 years on our way to Bristol, because we would come in from Route 11, come down towards the Emory entrance up today, not go under the underpass, but make a left up Hillman Highway, headed towards Meadowview, where a number of students would be. And by the way, we also transported elementary school kids from their home in Blacksburg over to the Meadowview Black Elementary School. So our bus solved a lot of problems for a lot of schools.
Wow. And you've been a part of the Methodist Church your whole life. Your home church is Ebenezer
That's right.
in Glade, and in recent years you've also come to play the piano at Charles Wesley.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about those two churches?
Sure enough, sure enough. Well, let me start with Ebenezer,
Sure.
simply because that was where I made my first debut. It was Christmas of 1957, and I played Silent Night with one finger on the right hand and three fingers on the left hand, something that I had learned from a kit that I got through the mail. Back in the old days, on the back of magazines and comic books and stuff, they often were coupons, and there was a particular coupon which said, "Do you want to learn how to play the piano?" And so I cut out the coupon and sent it in for about, I'd say less than $10, maybe $7 or $8, I can't remember. I mean, that was a lot for a kid, but I guess my mom felt that it was a worthwhile thing to do. By the way, she could already play. Her mother had taught her. And so I sent off and got this kit, learned how to play Silent Night, and I played it just before Christmas in our Sunday school gathering, not at the church service, but in Sunday school. And from there, it sort of exploded, I guess you might say. By 1958 and 59, we already had our junior choir, and we were doing all of the music for our services at Ebenezer. And I have to explain why that happened so fast. Before we started doing that, the adult population had dwindled such that there was no one in the choir anyway.
Now that's part of the story of how the black population in Washington County diminished over the years as people moved away.
Exactly.
So you're saying that the
So
adults in the church were gone, but the youth and children remained.
Right. There was, the baby boomers. We were born like after World War II, which would be, in other words, I was born in 47, and a lot of kids that I grew up with, we were all born in that area of time. So we were approaching teenagehood at that time. And we had a minister who lived in Bristol but had ties to Virginia, specifically the rural retreat area and whatnot. Reverend Coffey was his name. He had a car, which I understand before him there weren't too many ministers that even had a car. How did they get to Glade Spring? Either by bus or by the train, and did their service. But anyway, I mentioned the fact of him having a car simply because by 1960 we were traveling all over singing.
Oh, okay.
Not just in Abingdon, not just in Bristol, but he was an African-American gentleman who knew other African-American ministers in the region. So we went as far as Norton in one direction, as far as Rogersville in another direction, and as far as Pulaski in another direction, all in that same period of time. Unfortunately, when I finished high school and folks who were younger than me finished, that was sort of the end of that bubble, if you will. And of course, when I left to go off to college in 65, I came back home a lot because my mother was still living there. But I didn't really come back for good until my mom needed me because of her declining health. So in, what year was it, 2001, I was back in Glade taking care of her, teaching at Emory. And in 2004, Charles Wesley's then pianist had a stroke. She survived the stroke, but she was not able to continue doing the music. So I volunteered. Not that I could do it every Sunday, but Ebenezer and Glade Spring, even when I was a kid, we only did service twice a month, second and fourth. So I told the folks at Charles Wesley I could come for the first and third, and whenever there's
when there's a fifth,
fifth
you're here at
Sunday,
Charles.
right. Yeah. But that's how I ended up at the two places. I need to also say about my music that I have never really studied music in the classic sense, other than that kit that I got in the
How
mail.
about that?
Of course, my mom showed me a few things, and most of it was, it was the gift from God that you hear people talk about. Maybe as a kid, I didn't quite understand it, but now as an old guy, I know what that's all about.
Yeah. Well, your mother is a character in the book. When I say character, she's a feature in the book,
Right.
And just strikes me as a remarkable person.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that you must think about her every day.
Yeah. Plus the fact that I'm in her house.
You're in her house.
Yeah, exactly.
And your family roots here are really striking. So your mother, you're in the house where your mother was born. Your grandmother was
Yes,
born.
that's right.
And you mentioned in the book that your great grandparents were born enslaved.
Well, at least my great grandfather on one side and my great grandmother on another side. I know that for sure.
And
There's another great grandmother who was from Abingdon, and I'm not sure whether I have no information on her about that.
and one was from the Whitfield area.
Yes, he
and
was
one
enslaved in Wythe County,
Okay, and the other was in Western North Carolina.
West Jefferson. That's
Mhm.
exactly right.
And did you ever meet them?
No, I never knew any of my grandparents. My grandmother died in 45, I think it was 1945, and I was born like 2 years later. So all of my knowledge of them is secondhand, but I will say the fact that I was born in, grew up in, and returned to the house in which they lived gives me an added element of knowledge that maybe somebody else would not necessarily have. They all were there. In other words, I can go home today and pick up a document that was my grandmother's memory book for when she was studying at Morristown College in like the late 1800s. By the way, the reason she was at Morristown was because of not having high school
Okay.
back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you were black in Washington County in the late 1800s or 1900s, your education stopped at 7th
So
grade.
if you're going to continue, you had to go
Yes.
to a place
Yeah.
like that.
And Morristown had a high school department
Uh-huh.
in addition to their...
For that reason.
Yeah, for that reason. And it wasn't just here. I am told that black kids from all across the South back in those days came to Morristown with a 7th grade education. Some left with a junior college degree.
I got to say, one thing that strikes me in you talking about your great grandparents, whom you didn't meet, I have strong memories of one of my great grandparents. My great grandmother lived to be 100 years old,
Wow.
and so I knew her a little bit. She was born in 1890.
Wow.
And so it just strikes me that when we talk about not just segregation, but when we talk about the Civil War and slavery, we sometimes say, "Oh, that's ancient history." But here sits someone whose great grandparents were born enslaved,
Exactly.
and I can remember my great grandmother, who was born in 1890, whose life would have overlapped
Sure.
with people born into slavery, just like your mother and your grandparents. And
Right,
so
right.
it puts into perspective that while in some ways it's a long time ago, if you tilt it a little bit differently,
It's not that long.
isn't
That's
that?
right. I had an older brother who was born in 1936.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was still alive in his early years.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him speaking of her. I think it was the year that he died, which would have been 2001. He was the guest speaker at an event in Glade Spring for Black History Month.
Mm-hmm.
So this would have been February of 2001, with him dying in May of 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about his memories of his grandmother. And so the point that you make is well noted, that even my generation, maybe I didn't get to experience the grandmother scenario, but just a few years more, and there are people that I know that did, including a cousin of mine who I visited often in Cincinnati in later years. She used to come all the way to Glade Spring and spend her summers. And her story, I won't go into details, but her story was things were normal when she came to Glade Spring, and she was hesitant to want to go back to Cincinnati.
A rougher place.
It was a rougher place, and her family said scenario was, in early years, was not good. So yeah, this was her escape.
Well, Jerry, I thank you for your time. I want to remind folks that this is the book. You can find it on Amazon, right?
Yes.
So
Amazon.
go and come again. Segregation, Tolerance, and Reflection, and keep an eye out for Jerry's next book on his career in education.
I'm trying to think of a good title. One of them might be, Lord, help me to hold out.
Lord, help me to hold out. There you go. I think there's a lot of people in education that are singing that song right now.
Singing that song.
Yeah.
The last year was a COVID. I'm not talking about teaching now. Teaching computer. Teaching about computer on computer was a rare experience. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, and maybe we can sit down and talk again.
Sure
sometime.
enough.
But we thank you for joining us, and we pray God's blessings on each and every one of you.